Good morning and welcome to Breaking Points. It's 2024. Krystal, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. I can't say that I feel great about what's coming at us in 2024, but ready or not, here we go. And we do have a lot to talk about. In the show this morning, some major things unfolding in Israel, a huge court decision that could trigger a constitutional crisis. And this comes as they've actually announced they are recalling some troops from Gaza. So we will tell you what all of that means. We also have major attacks in Ukraine as the West could be laying the groundwork to potentially try to come to some sort of negotiated solution there since things are not going particularly well. We have another state that is trying to kick Trump off of the ballot. And obviously, look, the Iowa caucuses are in weeks, which is absolutely insane to me. So things are coming down to the wire here. We've got Biden getting some dire poll numbers from MSNBC of all places. And Saagar making a little bit of news with his Tucker Carlson interview, Tucker coming after Ben Shapiro. So I'm actually really interested, Emily, to get your thoughts on all of that. Because as I was saying to you, I don't really have a dog in that fight.
Girl shows are fun, but Saagar really did do the impossible and made news over the holiday break. It took a lot, but he did it.
People were very, very interested in that interview. So we will show you that and talk a little bit about all of the fallout. But first, let's start with what is going on in Israel. I'll put this up on the screen. This is a huge development. The Israeli military announcing a partial drawdown. This is the headline from the New York Times. Israel says it will pull several brigades from the Gaza Strip. Let me just read you a little bit of this report. The Israeli military announced on Monday it will begin withdrawing several thousand troops from Gaza, at least temporarily, in what would be the most significant publicly announced pullback since the war began. They cited a growing toll on the Israeli economy. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. Following nearly 3 months of wartime mobilization, Daniel Hagari, the Israeli military spokesman, emphasized the move to demobilize some soldiers did not indicate any compromise on Israel's intention to continue fighting, and he did not mention the American request to scale back. He indicated some will be called back to service in the coming year. Still, the fighting remains intense across Gaza. And some of the details here, they say reservists from at least 2 brigades will be sent home this week, and 3 brigades will be taken back for training. They vary in size, up to roughly 4,000 troops per brigade. The Israeli military does not disclose how many troops it has deployed in Gaza. So hard to say exactly what this means in the grand scheme of things. Could be shifting to another phase. Something we've looked at here before on the show is just how, what huge cost this war is imposing on the Israeli economy. Of course, it's nothing compared to the suffering that Gazans are experiencing. But we know in terms of their stated goal of destroying Hamas, even by their own very rosy estimates they say they've killed roughly 8,000 Hamas fighters. Well, Hamas had a fighting force of roughly 30,000 people. And we know they haven't announced that they've been able to take out any of their top targets in terms of Hamas leadership. So they are nowhere close to their stated goal, which always seemed, to many analysts to be completely impossible, of taking out Hamas and destroying Hamas completely. And we do know also on the ground, Hamas continues to release their propaganda fighting videos, and they continue to have the ability to shoot rockets into Israel. So they are not, they're not in any kind of notable disarray. Let's go ahead and put this up on the screen. This is the latest Hamas propaganda fighting video that you can see. They're using a tunnel here. They see a tank. They're able to put this explosive on the tank, and they've got their sort of trademark little red arrow there, showing their target and putting this explosive device onto the tank, and then you're about to see it detonate. So in any case, intense fighting going on. They have been able to exact some casualties from the Israeli military. And you also have, as I was mentioning, major economic pressure on Israel. Part of that comes from the Houthis' ability to hold up shipping in the Red Sea. We're going to talk a little bit more of that in a minute. But put this Washington Post report up on the screen, and then Emily, I want to get your reaction. We've got a report saying that gross domestic product is going to fall from 3% growth to 1% in 2024. That may sound like not a lot, but that is actually really significant. Huge impact on Israel's high-tech sector. As many of the individuals who've been called up who are in the reserve forces who've been called up, work in the high-tech sector. Not only are they paying for those reservists, the bombs and the bullets, they're also supporting 200,000 evacuees who have been displaced from Israeli villages. They're being housed, they're being fed in hotels, all at government expense. You have tourism, which has completely flatlined. Tel Aviv beaches and the Old City in Jerusalem bereft of foreigners. Christmas celebrations in Bethlehem in the occupied West Bank were canceled. Construction, which is very dependent on Palestinian labor, that has all come to a near halt. They've suspended the work permits of more than 100,000 Palestinians. So the sort of labor force that does a lot of the jobs that Israeli citizens don't want to do is not being permitted to come in. So those industries have really taken a huge hit. And economists have estimated the war has cost the government about $18 billion. That's about $220 million a day. So, Emily, that's part of what they're citing in their decision to announce this partial drawdown.
And I think it's also worth remembering that the Biden administration for the last month or so has been anticipating publicly or saying that its best goal for Israel in the new year is exactly what the New York Times headline that you read from essentially said, is a scaling back of the invasion, if not indefinite pause of the invasion. That's basically exactly what Joe Biden, what we were hearing in press reports, what Joe Biden had been telling Netanyahu behind the scenes, is that the timeline is that as soon as the new year rolls around, this invasion of Gaza should be scaled back significantly. So I think it's worth remembering that, and also worth remembering the political pressures on Netanyahu at home, I think, get papered over in domestic American press. He has this wide spectrum of pressures from people within his own government, from members of the public. And Krystal, we're actually about to talk about some of the political reality that Netanyahu faces domestically when it comes to the legal landscape in Israel. The economic points are so well taken. That's another thing. It's easy to forget how disruptive the operation has been since October 7th to the daily lives of thousands and thousands of Israelis, and how disruptive it has been to the entire country. So the pressures on Netanyahu are just immense. So it's not at all surprising that Israel made this decision. But to your point, we're going to see what it actually means over the course of the next couple of days, and then into the future as well.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Just because they are drawing down some number of troops does not mean that the results will be any less brutal and deadly for Palestinians in Gaza, because we know that the air assault, the bombardment that they've faced, which has now completely destroyed northern Gaza. I mean, it's completely uninhabitable. There's barely any civilian infrastructure left, houses, apartment buildings, schools, hospitals, etc. And the South is not much better off. This has also been one of the most deadly periods, actually, in Israel's assault on Gaza. So the fact that they're withdrawing troops doesn't necessarily mean that the results are going to be any less brutal for Palestinians who, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit more, half of whom are now facing starvation conditions. But to your point, Emily, about the incredible pressures facing Netanyahu and an Israeli society, which frankly is in sort of chaos and disarray, put this up on the screen. So the judicial reform that critics call a judicial coup that Netanyahu and his governing coalition had pushed through has now been struck down by the Supreme Court. Now, this was all about the sort of balance of powers between the judicial branch and the legislative branch, led, of course, by Netanyahu and the Likud party. And they attempted to undercut some of the judiciary's power and the Supreme Court's power in particular. The Supreme Court now saying, no, we don't accept that, and striking it down in a narrow decision. Let me go ahead and read you a little bit of this report so you can get a sense of the crisis. They say, in a momentous ruling that could ignite a constitutional crisis, Israel's Supreme Court on Monday struck down a law passed by Bibi Netanyahu's right-wing government that was meant to limit the court's own powers by a majority of 8 judges to 7. It's likely to rekindle the grave domestic situation that began a year ago over the government's judicial overhaul plan, which sparked mass protests that brought the country to a near standstill at times, even as Israel is at war in Gaza. You have the Likud party calling the Supreme Court's decision in opposition to the nation's desire for unity, especially in a time of war. And then you have parliamentary opposition leader Yair Lapid hailing the court for, quote, faithfully fulfilling its duty to protect the people of Israel. And the reason that this is really tied into both October 7th and this war effort is, I mean, Netanyahu has almost no support in the country at this point, not on the right, not on the quote unquote left, liberal, anywhere. And part of that comes from a sense that by pushing through these reforms, which were incredibly divisive and also meant to attempt to get him off the hook for corruption charges that he was facing, that they really lost sight of the security situation. You know, you had troops who were moved from that area near Gaza that was most aggressively attacked on October 7th to the West Bank or near the West Bank to sort of placate his far right coalition partners. You have this list of security failures. There was just a big New York Times expose actually on how even on the day of October 7th, the IDF was in complete disarray, leaving ordinary people to try to fend for themselves for hours and hours and hours. And the sense was that this judicial reform, which really tore the country in two, had distracted them to the extent that not only did they fail to anticipate October 7th, but they were then unable to respond on that day. So that's part of how this is all tied in. And also, of course, Emily, you know, really calls into question the ability to maintain any sort of unity across the country and among the citizenry because this is such an incredibly divisive, difficult issue.
Yeah, another thing that I think has been, underplayed in the Western press is the amount of criticism that Netanyahu has faced, and even, sort of from the coalition, even from sort of the far right members, allies at points with Benjamin Netanyahu since October 7th. It has been brutal. Hostages that have been returned, the families of hostages who have not been returned. There have been really bad leaks out of some meetings that Netanyahu has had. There's been immense displeasure that he hasn't met with everyone. I think one meeting a few weeks back was capped at 15 people, something like that. And so he wasn't able at that particular meeting to confer with all of the families. And all of this has created a really bad domestic picture for Netanyahu. And to your point, this was passed by parliament in July, supported by people like Netanyahu. Israel does have a very, very powerful court. And reading from an old New York Times article before October 7th, they say supporters of the measure, which parliament, this is at the time, is expected to vote on next Monday, present it as a boon for democracy, a modest limit on the ways in which an elected government can be stymied by unelected judges who will in any case still have other tools to overrule ministers. So that's what this was essentially about, that the court could say, nope, on this definition of reasonableness. We will not rubber stamp this ministerial appointment. And for some people, they say that's reducing judicial oversight. For Netanyahu and his allies, they say, actually, that's really important to kind of push back on this idea of unelected judges. And that entire debate was roiling the country. There were mass protests that you mentioned, Krystal, and people certainly remember. And so this is a really, really difficult domestic situation for Netanyahu. It is not there is not a united front at home or even among his allies abroad about what Israel should do going forward. And it raises massive questions about, people talk about, and myself included, what does eradicating Hamas mean? What kind of comes up in that vacuum? Say the 8,000 number is accurate. So you've gotten rid of a third of Hamas fighters and a whole lot of the infrastructure. Okay, so what is Israel going to do for future steps in the war, Netanyahu or not? What is the plan? What does the Israeli government look like in the next 2 years, let alone 5 years? These things are really unsettled right now.
Absolutely. And as much as the country has really been torn into by these judicial, reforms or judicial coup attempt to strip power from the judiciary, in other areas, the country is very unified. And actually, guys, if you could put the last element in this block up, A11, a poll that shows overwhelmingly Jewish Israelis in particular, they say they're not concerned about Palestinian suffering. They don't think that Palestinian suffering should be considered in terms of planning the war effort. 81% of Israeli Jews say it should either be, not considered at all or considered very little. Total opposite view from Arab Israelis, have the complete counterpoint. Emily, appropriate counterpoint view there.
Great point.
And we've also seen polling, of course, about overwhelmingly, especially Jewish Israelis, they feel that the IDF, if anything, hasn't been brutal enough. 1.8% said that they had gone too far in their assault on Gaza. There was a huge number in favor of basically the ethnic cleansing plan, which we're going to get to, as well of quote unquote voluntary migration of Palestinians out of Gaza. Now, how voluntary is migration when your home has been bombed and your children are being starved to death? We'll talk about that again in just a moment. But huge, huge developments. And just to give people a sense, lastly, on this judicial reform and striking down that law by the Supreme Court, of how fraught this has been. There's actually a lawmaker, a former cabinet member from Netanyahu's Likud party, Galit Distel Atbarian, sorry, I'm sure I said that name wrong, who just apologized for being involved in this. They said, I'm here sitting and telling you, the democratic secular public, I sinned against you. I caused pain for you. I caused you to fear for your lives, and I am sorry for this. So it shows you how high emotions are running, that even someone who was involved in this attempt said that they sinned against the liberal secular public. Let's go ahead and move on to another incredibly important part of this story, which we just cannot lose sight of, which is the risk of a larger escalation into a regional war, and of the way that our own troops have become directly implicated in what Israel is doing here. Put this up on the screen. So the U.S. just killed 10 Houthis, and they sunk 3 ships after a Houthi Red Sea attack. U.S. helicopters repelled an attack by Iran-backed Houthi militants on a Maersk container vessel in the Red Sea. Is that how you say that? I don't really know. Anyway, it's a large shipping company in the Red Sea, sinking 3 ships and killing 10 militants, according to accounts by Americans and Houthi officials on Sunday. The naval battle occurred around 3:30 GMT on Sunday as the attackers sought to board the Singapore-flagged Maersk Hangzhou. Maersk and U.S. CENTCOM said helicopters from the USS Eisenhower and USS Gravely joined the ship's security team in repelling the attackers after receiving a distress call. Interestingly, the USS Eisenhower is actually withdrawing from the region. It's been there from the beginning. As an interesting note, I believe it's the Eisenhower that's withdrawing. This comes as, put this up on the screen, an Iranian warship has now entered the Red Sea. Iran's Al-Borz warship entered the Red Sea. A semi-official news agency reported on Monday at a time of soaring tensions on the key shipping route amid the Israel-Hamas war and attacks on vessels by forces allied to Tehran, and the UK looking to get more involved in these attacks on Houthis and even floating direct attacks, airstrikes on Houthi rebels. Put this next one up. Britain is reportedly considering airstrikes on Houthi rebels after the U.S. said its Navy sank 3 boats that had been targeting a container ship in the Red Sea. Grant Shapps, the defense secretary, said the government would not hesitate to take direct action to prevent further attacks amid reports the UK and U.S. are preparing a joint statement to issue a final warning to the Yemeni group. Obviously, this is massively significant. We are directly engaging and killing Houthi militants. We have put together this attempt at a coalition so that we aren't the only ones who are being attacked or facing these risks. But Emily, all of our allies effectively have been extraordinarily reluctant. The coalition, such as it is quite lackluster, includes next to no Arab allies. There were a number of countries who didn't want to publicly be associated with it. So there's, the level of just the humiliation of the U.S. trying to pull something together here that ended up not going very well and continues to not go very well. You still have shipping basically blocked through this area of the Red Sea, which is massively significant for global trade and is applying pressure to global commerce, but in particular Israeli commerce. But then you also have just the incredible risk of this blowing up into something much larger than it already is and dragging us much more directly into these sorts of engagements with so many of our troops still in the region. There are huge risks that abound.
So many of our troops still in the region just completely fanned out across the Middle East in ways that have been highlighted over the past couple of months. People didn't know that we had troops as broadly and prolifically as we do across the region, and as many troops as we do across the region. But it's always worth keeping in mind because it underscores, to your point, what a powder keg this situation is. And we're going to talk about Ukraine shortly, but I think it is really worth remembering that this is happening on a split screen. That one of the most terrifying things after October 7th and since has been the way that China, Russia, all of these different sort of emerging blocs have responded to different threats and different events that have cropped up over the course of the post-October 7th conflict. And that is really, really scary stuff. And what we are seeing in the naval sector here is a lack of American control, a lack of control among, to your point, our friends, people who are at least are countries that are supposed to be the friends of the U.S. Biden looks completely out of control, and that's always been the case. When you see these scrappy groups, come in and upend our ability to hold certain areas, whatever it is, since September 11th. I mean, it's always embarrassing when stuff like this happens, but there seems to just be no cohesion in the response here, and that becomes clear and clear every day.
The US and Israel are basically on an island in terms of world opinion, in terms of view of Israel's assault on Gaza. And the longer that Israel's attacks on Gaza continue, the more at risk not only our troops in the region are, but the more at risk we are of getting pulled into this broader conflict. And one of the updates that I did over the holiday, I talked about the insanity of a former Israeli prime minister in the Wall Street Journal demanding that we try to foment regime change in Iran. Outrageous, completely insane. But you, of course, have the typical hawks in the US, people like Lindsey Graham, people like John Bolton, out there aggressively calling for us to directly attack Iran, even though Iran, yes, they support Hamas. Yes, of course, they support the Houthis. They were not directly involved in planning October 7th. But, these warmongers, they just use any excuse to try to get their favorite goal accomplished, which is a direct war with Iran. This ties into the Israeli domestic political situation as well, because Netanyahu is, basically hated across the board in Israeli society. And the only way that he's been able to hold on to power and remain where he is as prime minister is by keeping this conflict going. And so he can say, listen, yes, there are many questions that need to be answered about the security situation, the intelligence failures leading up to October 7th, but that's all for after the war. So he has this incentive to keep this war going indefinitely. And he also has an incentive, and they've been making a lot of noises and have been sort of laying the groundwork to open up another full front with Hezbollah in Lebanon after they pull back in Gaza. So this is, massively risky. The Israeli, domestic political situation is pushing them in the direction of actually wanting a broader war. And we've seen no ability of Biden and the US administration to push back on anything that Israel is doing, including drawing us into this broader conflict, which we've already, by nature of our engagement here with the Houthis, which we've already been drawn into. I want to go ahead and turn for a moment here, because I never want to lose sight of the immense suffering that is unfolding in Gaza right now, which is really unlike anything else that we have seen in this century. Put this up on the screen. We now have a report from the UN that half of Gazans are in danger of starvation. They are starving. Something like 90% reports that they regularly go a full day without eating anything. And huge numbers are at risk due to the collapse of the healthcare system. Israel targeting hospitals both in the north and the south of Gaza. Very few remain in operation. There's very little in the way of medical supplies as well. This tweet says we could see almost a quarter of Gaza's population, close to 500,000 human beings dying within a year, largely deaths from preventable health causes and collapse of the medical system. It's a crude estimate, but one that is data driven. Let me read you a little bit of what's going on here. They say, tragically, the nearly unprecedented death and injury we've seen so far is likely to only be the beginning. From looking at similar conflicts across the world, public health experts know we are likely to see more children dying from preventable disease than from bullets and bombs. The World Health Organization spokesperson said diarrhea rates among children in refugee like camps in Gaza were already in November, early November, this is a while ago now, more than 100 times normal levels. And there are effectively no treatments available. Children can become dehydrated and die quickly. Diarrheal diseases are the second leading cause of death in children under 5 worldwide. They're caused by contaminated water sources, lack of access to oral rehydration fluids. Upper respiratory infections, chickenpox, and painful skin conditions have also increased. There are fears that the recent floods may result in untreated sewage mixing with fresh water used for drinking and cooking and cause a cholera outbreak. This is something Ryan's been flagging for a while now, that oftentimes in war zones, especially when you have, all of the sanitation, basic sanitation has been destroyed. You have people living in these crowded camp situations, that oftentimes the disease that spreads is even deadlier than the bombs and the bullets, which have been plenty deadly enough. So incredibly dire situation unfolding there with no end in sight. Put this next piece up on the screen. You'll remember in the early days after October 7th, there was a lot of discussion of how the Hamas attack was equivalent to 15 9/11s for a nation of Israel's size. Well, they sort of stopped doing this 9/11 math now, because the equivalent figure for Gaza, where more than 20,000 people have now been killed, is approaching 900 9/11s. I actually recommend people read this entire Mother Jones article, How Joe Biden Became America's Top Israel Hawk, because it digs into the fact that he has long been one of the most hawkish with regards to Israel, one of the greatest allies of everyone, every Israeli prime minister, including Netanyahu, how he actually actively undermined some Obama and Hillary Clinton initiatives to back Netanyahu during a time when those relations were very fraught. So it's incredibly interesting and revealing history for understanding how and why Joe Biden is doing what he is and giving them unconditional support in this moment.
Yeah, and I'm curious how this evolves because, again, worth remembering that the Biden administration was telegraphing through the press and otherwise that they wanted in the new year Israel to scale down this invasion. And we don't know because, again, Biden is facing immense pressure in the middle of this non-primary primary, but Democrats around the country are facing immense pressure in an election year as well over their support for Netanyahu and Netanyahu's government and the Israeli military and all of its sort of strategic decisions. And so that has been a point of contention between Biden and Netanyahu. And where does this go? If Biden's pressure, and we'll learn more in the days to come, if the Biden administration's pressure was absolutely instrumental in what proves to be a long-term, indefinite sort of pause in this invasion, that's a very different question. It's a different side of Biden. We'll see potentially, and the Mother Jones article highlights how this would be a different side of Biden when it comes to Netanyahu. And it just highlights the political pressures here at home, the political pressures actually abroad at places like the United Nations, at allied countries that think differently and have always approached this conflict differently than the United States. And that raises one more huge question, Krystal, and this is where the rubber really meets the road for me. The eradication of Hamas, when you're looking at that 9/11 number in particular, this stands out. The aftermath of our response to 9/11, as many people have highlighted since October 7th, was a lot of power vacuums that actually allowed really radical movements to fester. And is that what is being set up? Like, what is the plan? Because there really is not going to be a response that fully eradicates Hamas from Israel. And it sure as heck is not going to eradicate that kind of underlying ideology and a long-term drawn out response, Krystal, along the lines that you just mentioned, the humanitarian concerns for civilians when it comes to wide scale illness and starvation. What does that do in Israel's interest going forward? This is a lesson that many countries have had to learn over the last several decades about what happens in inhumane power vacuums and whether it is ultimately in the interest of a country like Israel or a country of the United States for that situation to continue long term. And that's just looming over all of this right now.
Yeah, there's no doubt that they are radicalizing many more than they are eradicating. There's just no doubt about that. And you can see through the history of recent Israeli politics that when Palestinians feel that they have a chance at a peaceful resolution through negotiation, support for armed resistance and radical groups like Hamas drops. And when they don't feel that they have that opportunity or that possibility, support for Hamas and other radical groups rises. And we already see, obviously it's very difficult in Gaza to conduct a poll at the moment, but there's indications that support for Hamas has actually gone up during this time period. And in the West Bank, it's very clear where, they don't have to deal with the failures of Hamas governance. And they are suffering, don't get me wrong, but not at the level or extent that Palestinians in Gaza are right now. And support for Hamas, as opposed to the Palestinian Authority, which is, basically a collaborator with the occupying force, support for Hamas has skyrocketed. So in terms of quote unquote eradicating Hamas, they have utterly failed and only made the situation worse, at great risk to their own population and at great risk to us as well, because these bombs that are being dropped somewhere around 30,000 at this point, a majority of which are quote unquote dumb bombs being dropped indiscriminately on civilian populations. These are made in America and we continue to ship them. We continue to expedite, in fact, military weaponry to Israel, even as our own president admits that they are engaged in quote unquote indiscriminate bombing, which is, of course, a war crime. The last piece I want to bring you this morning is, it's been pretty clear for a while now what the ultimate goal of Netanyahu and his coalition partners are, what their goal is for the quote unquote day after in Gaza. And the goal is ethnic cleansing. And now they are saying it much more clearly. So put this up on the screen. This is one of the ministers in the Netanyahu government, Bezalel Smotrich. He says that Gaza is a ghetto. If we act strategically, they will emigrate. And we Israelis will live there. We won't let 2 million stay. With 100 to 200,000 in Gaza, the quote day after debate will be different. They want to leave. They've been living in a ghetto for 75 years. Yeah, I'm sure many do want to leave an active war zone where they are being bombed and starved to death and their homes are being destroyed. You also had the National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, on Monday said the Netanyahu government should, quote, encourage the migration of Gazans out of the Palestinian enclave. He says, quote, this is a correct, just, moral, and humane solution during a meeting of his Jewish Power Party in Jerusalem. So these are two ministers in the Netanyahu government. These are not nobodies. These are incredibly influential voices within his coalition. And they're saying outright that, pushing Gazans permanently out of the Gaza Strip is the ultimate goal. There's been a plan that has been floated reportedly in the U.S. with some bipartisan interest to use U.S. aid dollars to basically force local Arab allies of the United States to take in this refugee population. And so, this has been pretty obvious for a while, but now there's not even any denials around it. It's coming directly from top officials themselves. And, I think every U.S. politician and every U.S. media figure needs to be asking every U.S. politician about whether or not they support this and what their plan is to stop it.
Another reminder of the biggest disconnect in the war, which is that Joe Biden publicly says he believes in a two-state solution. Joe Biden's government is instrumental in the prosecution of this war. Without the United States, not just, we supply about 20% of their annual military budget, but the question is munitions. So when Joe Biden's government is prosecuting this war and the U.S. is prosecuting this war, and Netanyahu says, for years, he does not believe in a two-state solution. That disconnect is not sustainable, and it is not a tenable situation to lay, or let's say justification to lay waste to civilian populations if the two major powers involved in the war are on completely, this is not a minor difference. They're on completely different pages in completely different universes when it comes to the end goal. And that is a recipe for disaster. And I say that as somebody who actually believes that there was a real necessity for a military response after October 7th. There shouldn't have been a ceasefire October 8th, October 9th, October 10th. But you cannot lay waste to civilian populations with that level of a disconnect, because it means that you are intentionally driving headfirst into a quagmire and causing suffering without a clear path out of that destruction. It's embarrassing that we are involved in a conflict where there's that little clarity about what the end goal is, that has caused and is continuing to cause so much suffering. That's the thing that really is among the most disgusting elements of all of this.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.